I don't need to do that. Okay, I'm just gonna give the table a smack, then we're in the right thing. Germana, how do you pronounce your last name?
Rovinelli.
Rovinelli, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. I am really excited. Germana has a book. We'll get into that towards the end of it, but awesome.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, totally. I'm really glad that you can come on and you can be open, and I know it's a lot, or it can feel like a lot, but I'm really happy to hear you came a long ways. I'm really thankful for that. We've been chatting for a while trying to get you out here, and here you are. So yeah, we'll just go into it however you want, what it was like, what happened, whatever direction we go.
Yeah. For me, what it was like in my life was a lot of confusion, a lot of not knowing how to cope with life and not knowing how to take care of myself in a way that made sense. For me, I unfortunately came from a family that didn't have a healthy legacy, and so that legacy of dysfunction was passed on to me and my brother, and then I was left with this message about what is so terribly wrong about me. I looked at my history and some of the losses that were sustained quite early, and I realized that I'd had a broken heart from a very young age, but I had no tools to even have words to say, oh, I hurt here. I really believe that life was something to be endured, and it was hard, and my role was to take care of other people's feelings or their needs in order to survive.
Right.
And that eventually spiraled into, some lovely, helpful traits, but also spiraled into a lot of self-abandonment, a lot of low self-worth, a lot of pain that I didn't have the tools to deal with.
Right.
So I eventually continued to break my heart.
Right.
Yeah.
So where it starts? Where does that start for you? Where does that pain start? And where does it,
For me, the pain, I believe, when I look at my life, started when I was probably pre-verbal. I had a distinct message that I was in trouble, there was something wrong. There was emotional volatility in my parents' relationship. And so there was a lot of fighting and yelling and screaming, and I didn't feel that I was in a good place. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel that there was anything other than for me to try to fix things that were completely out of my pay grade, my knowledge base, my league as a human being. So in many ways, it was chaos and crisis, and then abuse. And from there, if I was not able to conduct myself in a way that I was expected to conduct myself, I was beaten. So essentially, I kind of had these mini, I would call them, like, they're not really a death, but a part of the psyche has to shut down in order to survive that. Right. So a part of the growing and the healing and the playing and the joyfulness is lost because it's not safe to be that or to do that.
It's not safe to be you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's nothing safe about being me and the family that I came from. And what I learned to do was think that it was somehow my responsibility to fix it, to mend it. My parents were severely traumatized from their upbringing. And, one of the common messages was screamed at me, "You're bad and it's all your fault." And some of this stuff, was said to me before I even knew what those words meant. Mm-hmm. So I just felt like I was like a throwaway of no value is a nice way of putting it. I basically shut down, became quite an introvert, and hid a lot. and did everything I could to be off the radar, and then used things like television, sugar. My parents gave us alcohol as children, and anything to get away from the monotony or the feeling of meaninglessness of my life.
Yeah.
The one area that I excelled as a child was in athletics, which was so strange, because I was able to run fast because it was the one thing I could do. For me, when I look at it, I think that a lot of it started when I was probably under 2, because I wasn't allowed to have feelings.
Yeah.
I wasn't allowed to cry. I wasn't allowed to express my needs. And if I did, I was severely punished. And that was later articulated to me as that you weren't traumatized, that you were tortured. And I was like, wow. And if that's what my world has been taught, that that's my normal, then I'm going to think of everything that way and then try to normalize crisis and chaos and abuse and neglect through my life. And at some point, as I got, older and parts of my life became extremely dysfunctional and tragic, I realized that if I didn't take responsibility to find out what happened, like how did I get to think this was okay? How did I get to have such low self-esteem or to think so little of myself? How did that happen? If I hadn't have got to that place, I would have just kept on going, and I probably would have become, that woman that's got a series of children from different fathers, with her teeth missing, on social assistance, living in a trailer park, waiting for somebody else to pretend that I matter when I didn't know how to acknowledge that I mattered. I look at my addictive behavior was suppressing my feelings.
Yeah.
Because if you can't feel, then you can't even acknowledge that spirit of that truth. This is my truth. This is what's happening. And so then the next behavior is to shut it down with whatever. It can be anything. So I look at the history and I really don't believe I had much of a chance. And yet, for whatever reason, I managed to navigate some painful, awful situations that one of my clients, when he read my book, he goes, "You just wouldn't die." He goes, "You could have died so many times and you didn't." And I'm like, I guess I wasn't meant to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're here. You're
I am
telling
here.
your story,
Yeah.
which is cool. You so he was saying like you wouldn't die. What in your childhood, like for people that are watching, what did you go through? Like what was a part of your pain?
Well, my father, I believe, when I look back at his behavior, I think that anyone that did what he would do has to be a psychopath, because he blamed me basically for being alive. He blamed me for acting like a child. He blamed me for not knowing how to do things that were, he would expect me to do things that were completely age inappropriate and then punish me severely. And some of the punishments were, when I was pre-verbal, he actually strangled me in the high chair because I didn't want to continue to eat. And I turned blue, eyes rolled up in the back of my head, and I was basically checked out. I didn't have a memory of that. That only came back until I tried to feed my son in a high chair, and all of a sudden I had all of these bizarre emotions that made no sense. And when I spoke to my mother about it, she started weeping. And I said, "Why are you crying?" And she told me this is what happened. And I was like, oh my God, no wonder. But my dad was, he was very intelligent. He spoke 7 languages fluently. He was very intelligent. So even as a child, if he would try to force me to be smart, because he figured I could survive this world if I was smart. So he would sit me down with a book and an encyclopedia. And this is probably 3 and 4 and 5. I'm still quite young. I really don't know what I'm understanding. And he would want me to understand what he was trying to force me to learn. And I couldn't take it in. Number one, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't breathe properly. I was terrified. And then if I didn't understand it, he would beat me and say, "You stupid idiot, you'll be good for nothing." whatever. And he'd made me look up the dictionary word. I still didn't know what that meant. And then if I couldn't pull it together and stop crying, then he would start to drown me in the sink. So this was part of his way of trying to father or teach me. And so subsequently, I thought that I was really stupid. There was something terribly wrong with me. He was always unsatisfied, and that I would really amount to nothing. And then, and from there, eventually my mother managed to get him to leave the house, which was great. But then her depression and her alcoholism took over. So, I mean, he wasn't able to father me. He wasn't able to say, I'm so grateful that you're alive. I'm so happy that you're a girl. I cherish you. What color is your favorite color? He was not able to acknowledge that I had any needs other than I needed to do what made him feel better about himself. Right. So my job was to take care of his feelings, and my mother. They were both like that. And that is abuse and neglect right out the gate. And like as a child, I had some lovely times. Like we had horses that we would go horseback riding, and I loved to hang out at the beach, and we lived right next to Sealand. So I spent a lot of time there by myself and all the rest of it. But I ended up with a fast food, a candy food addiction. I was always eating, cup of sugar, eating, because there was no one home. We didn't really have a family. We were shattered as a family. And I was trying to figure out how to have meaning in that family. And I really didn't. Yeah. Yeah, I think that really started like from the very beginning. It was kind of like a feeling of being completely displaced. Yeah. And then I'd see some of my friends and they'd have time with their family, and their family would do something nice. And I was like, oh my God, is that what that looks like?
It's like foreign to you.
Oh, it was like,
what is this?
It was like watching something that I had no idea about.
Yeah. Just didn't make sense.
I was confused.
Yeah.
And I just didn't understand why we were different. And I thought, well, maybe it's because we're European. Maybe it's because we're poor. But I think I look at it from a different place where it's generational trauma passed on and passed on and passed on and passed on. And then my brother and I both absorbed it. And my life burned down pretty hard earlier. And he was able to pretend that everything was okay.
So when you talk about generational trauma, for people who might not fully understand what you mean, can you explain generational trauma and how?
I'll do my best.
Okay.
I don't know that much about the generations beyond my grandparents, but my grandfather on my mother's side, I believe he was Polish, and he worked for Hitler. And so he was working for Hitler. They had 9 children, I believe. And my mother was born when World War I or World War II started. And so they were in East Germany. And he helped the Gestapo do what they needed to do. Now, you got to tell me that that's trauma. Regardless. So my mother's born. There's bombing. People are dying. And he's also a pedophile. So he's sexually assaulting my mother. And that's got to be silenced. When my mother's mother go to the priest to say, please help me stop my husband from having sex with my children, she was shamed by the church and said, well, if you looked after your wifely duties, he wouldn't need to do that. So then she would go back crying. So there's this huge split there. And then my mother has absorbed this trauma. But there's this don't talk, don't think, don't feel rule that's instilled in all of them. And then so she has her trauma and an abandonment, all of the rest of it. And then my father also comes from severe poverty from World War II. He's post-World War II in occupied Italy. And they were a family that were incredibly poor. And his mother was blind and his father was mentally ill, and they had a bunch of children that they couldn't afford to pay for. So they were beggars and stealers and all of that. And so the father at some point ended up being put in an institution, and the mother, who was blind, needed to select the children that could help produce by stealing and begging whatever needed to be done. And my father and a few of his family, like a few of his siblings, were brought to an orphanage, and they were told, "I'll come back for you." And she never came back for her son. She left my father there, and he was sexually abused by the people that run the churches in that particular time, and shamed and blamed for that. And he just drilled down hard and got a lot of education and became bilingual, and we spoke 7 languages fluently. So now all of this is buried. He would pee the bed. He peed the bed probably till he was 13 or 14, shamed for that. But that's a sign there's something wrong. Like, let's not talk about the fact that they're peeing the bed. And then eventually these two meet in a very strange way with all this shame and sexual attraction because of high hormones. My mother is married to somebody else. She's run away from East Germany before they build the Berlin Wall. And she marries a butcher, which is a sign of stability and economics. And I won't starve to death like I was starving as a child. Her fingernails fell out all the time because of malnutrition during World War II. And there was a huge production of owls that were eating off of all of the rats that were eating off of the bodies. My mother remembered that from her childhood. Like, all of a sudden there was a tremendous amount of these owls that were surviving off of the rats that were living off of the corpses, which is like pretty horrible. So my mother's married to this man. She's beautiful. She's young. She's an incest survivor. She's got no coping skills, zero. Hormones are running. And she meets my father at a dance. And how she explained it to me was, you know, my husband saw your father and I dancing, and he went home and hung himself. And of course, that was her way of saying, you know, he caught us having sex, and to punish my mother, he went home and hung himself to punish my mother. And when my mother came home and found him, you know, obviously she's horrified. And so she races to talk to my father, who then feels it's his responsibility to rescue this woman who he's been fornicating with and who's married, and he knows better, but he did it anyway because his hormones took over, not his common sense. And out of obligation and guilt and responsibility, he decided to marry her. So there's like these different lives of trauma, no skills, no talking. Let's just go on impulse and what we think is the right thing. No one's telling the truth. Do I really want to do this? He did not want to. That's obvious. But later on, his behavior towards my mother and us screamed that he didn't want to. It was too late. We were already born. So I always say, stop talking. Your actions are screaming too loud. And so these two families come together. He, out of obligation, decides to marry my mother and then decides to have children with her. And as soon as the children came, the abuse did. My mom said he didn't change until you arrived, until you children arrived. And it was that he wanted the attention. And when we needed the attention, he wasn't able to get it. He was resentful and jealous. And then if we couldn't stop having needs like a child does, then he would try to beat us. And then that didn't work because we'd keep crying. And then he'd have to find another way to stop us from crying so he could not be disturbed by our emotional needs. So that's an example of my generational trauma. And for me, they trained us to don't think, don't talk, don't feel. Basically, shut the fuck up. Do what I say, not as I do. You're bad, and my suffering is your fault. So that's a lot of shame to be dumped on anybody, but I didn't even understand it. All I knew was that I was different. I was scared. And when I got into using, some of the beginner drugs, it helped me to feel more relaxed. It helped me to feel more confident. It helped me to feel more at ease that my life probably could be okay. But what also happened within that for me was that I was, in a shark pool and didn't know it.
And that's when you talk about generational trauma, like what happened to your parents and how it gets passed on to you because it's like a learned behavior, and then all of a sudden it's being passed on to you, and your coping mechanism starts to become outside substances you're putting in yourself that are helping you to stay calm as you're in this Shark Tank. So when I talk to people about addiction, like we're getting into, it's almost always a result of trying to escape pain, right, and stay safe.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's all good. And I think that, most people, whether they're picking up a substance, an illicit substance, or they're gambling, or they're like whatever they're doing, it's a way of not having a real relationship with themselves, because there's a sense of there's nothing worth exploring in here, or that this is going to make me happy. And it doesn't work. But a lot of people keep chasing that, and then their brain's been hijacked by that behavior or that substance, and often they forfeit their life, or they forfeit intimacy, like true intimacy, or any of that, because they don't know how to do it, because I haven't been taught. Like I used to say when I first started to work on my recovery pieces, that I was like a feral cat, a wild cat, that I didn't know how to feel safe. I did not know how to connect with people. I did it more as a test. Does this work? Does this work? Will I get hit if I do this? It was just very strange. And then eventually I had enough courage to go, okay, you do have a life. You do have the right to give yourself what your parents couldn't give you. You do have a right to give yourself what the addiction robbed you of. And then I just started to follow what made sense to me, what filled my heart. And as I, would take a few steps forward, I would take a few steps back, a few steps forward, a few steps back, to unpack some of the trauma, or unpack the low self-esteem, or unpack some of my own learning disabilities. Because I would say I do have some. They're not severe, but if I get anxious around something, I can't process anymore. It's over for me. And the pain for me, again, it went back to a broken heart, that I think that broken heart was passed on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you try, and it's almost like you're so far away from yourself all the time to try and stay away from the hurt, and the pain, that when you're saying, when you start to get anxious or frustrated, it's like natural to get away from it. It's just, and it's been passed down to you, right? Wow. So going through this, how did this navigate through your teens into that area of your life and relationships?
Oh, yeah. Well, by the time I was, I hadn't even hit puberty. We were living in a beautiful area in Cobble Hill. We had horses. We had a beautiful place there, and this is again another traumatic event that just was repeated. My mother clearly was sexually abused. So when sexual abuse started to happen in my life, it happened at about 11, that I know of. When I was 11 years old, the landlord's son, who was 18, was sexually assaulting me. But he would come into where we lived, and he would try to get me stoned or drunk, and then sexually assault me. And I remember at one point my mother saw him doing this. And instead of her stopping him and saying, "How dare you touch my daughter? How dare you?" she took out my horsewhip, and in front of him started whipping me in front of him. And the blood is running down my back. And I'm speechless, because basically all that tells me is that it's my fault that this has happened. Somehow I'm responsible for him being, interested in me that way. And I'm just shut down. Boom, 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 boom. And so what that did was it gave him the green light. As much as he wanted, no one was ever going to protect me. I was there for his joy whenever he decided, and I sure didn't appreciate it. But there was no way for me to ever escape that. And so that, he would give me pot, try to get me as high as possible, and then, basically molest me. And at some point, I think he got frightened because he realized he could get me pregnant. And I think he was quite afraid of that. He didn't want consequences. And we eventually moved. We moved to Maple Ridge, when my mother then had met a man who she was going to bring into our life, who had two older children, and one of her older children, his older children, was just an asshole. Like my mom used to say, he was a good excuse for birth control. If you met him, you would know why people have birth control. But he was sexually assaulting me. I think I was 14 at the time. And I didn't fit in the school because I was a country girl. And, this was going on. And I was like, I hate this. I don't want to be here. I'm not safe. I don't like this. When they would go to work, I'd come, and then I said to my mom, he's doing this to me. And she was very incapable of hearing me. And she just slapped me across the face and said, you're lying. You just want attention. And that night I packed my bags and I ran away. And I ran away to Vancouver Island to be closer to what I felt was my home, because I really didn't have one. And I ended up, staying, at someone's house who had two big brothers, and they both sexually assaulted me while I was there, which was horrific. And they were full-grown men. One of them has changed his name, and I won't say the name. And then I ended up getting thrown in jail, which was interesting, for shoplifting, because I needed a face cloth to wash my face.
Really?
Yeah. I remember being asked, why are you taking this? And I said I wanted to wash my face. And so then I was put into jail, and then I was put into some form of foster care. When I was in the foster care home, one of the other people in that foster care home was also a larger man who did sexually assault me. And my foster mom tried to act like I had anything to do with that. And I'm like, I'm in a trailer. This guy is in the same trailer with me. He's horny, and he's got to be, 6 years older than me. It was weird. So I ran away from that there, and then I refused to go to my mother's home. And I'd met a girl in school. We were really good friends, sort of. We were weird. We were crazy. And I think I had a probation officer at the time because I was a criminal.
Yeah.
Right? And I said, I won't go back to my mother's house. And I won't go back to that foster home because of the way this happened. And no one would listen to me anyways.
Yeah.
I'll be talking to a doorknob. So they put me into my girlfriend's house as a foster kid there, which was ridiculous because the mother was a raging drug addict. Yeah, we did lots of LSD and all the rest of it, and watched The Young and the Restless, and sat there with her mom and the others, and were completely out of control. And so I was then immersed into a different culture. I thought I died and went to heaven, but drugs were everywhere.
Yeah.
Everywhere. And, that eventually transitioned into relationships with men that were much older than me. And because I thought I'm going to be sexually assaulted anyway, I may as well just pick. I had no sense that I have a right to decide here. And it spiraled quite badly. I ended up heavily addicted to, a particular chemical by the time I was 16. And, once I got onto that, I was basically insane.
Yeah.
And I was living with another fellow who was also a drug dealer. And, I taught him how to use that drug really well. And we did a lot of that together. And we also managed to both get black belts together and karate at the same time, and on and off. And, I got into a fitness career. But I remember using so much of this product at a time that I would do grand mal seizures. And then there was a few times where I was definitely clinically left my body, clinically dead, felt myself no longer in my body, felt myself go to a whole other place that was just full of a tremendous amount of euphoric love. Yeah. The kind that I don't think you can really feel in this particular dimension. I have no idea. But while I was there, I was very aware of two beings and this presence of incredible love all around me. these two beings talking to me. And I was like, oh, I'm so happy to be here. This is the place to be. This is home, right? Yeah. I want to go home. And I remember this very specific conversation. I don't remember all the details, but I was immediately transitioned right back into my body. And I was like, shit, what am I doing here? Yeah. I don't want to be here. And I remember opening my eyes and saying, I want to go home now. And the reality is I was home and I'd clearly checked out. And whether it was a week or so later, I was escorted out of that establishment with a gun pointing at my head saying, you're leaving. And I did. I left. I got my little dog and I got I took my car and the few things that I owned and I left. And I left with a lot of drugs on me because I was still using a lot of drugs. And I came to Vancouver Island and was hoping to at least stop killing myself with drugs and really shitty choices. In that interim, like in that whole transitional time, I'd had a couple of really bad car accidents and I'd ended up with an ICBC settlement. And I had nobody to coach, parent, educate me on how to manage that money. And that money could have bought me a couple of really beautiful homes. And I would have been set for life if I would have had somebody that was adult around me. And instead, all that money went into using. So by the time I crashed, I was scared. I was not well trained, and I didn't want to live with my mother, but that's where I went because I had nowhere else to go. I didn't want to stay there. I actually hated my mother. And I didn't know why, but I hated my mother. I really did. Yeah. I think I hated my mother more than I hated my father. But I can only remember the stuff my mother had done, and I had buried the stuff that my father had done. So it was like I didn't like either of these humans, and I didn't trust people at all. So I ended up going to Victoria and hanging around, and I found somebody that was an elderly gentleman who was a biker and a Wiccan high priest, and tell you everything you want to hear, and we're souls from a past life, we're supposed to be together. In a very short period of time, I married this man who was basically a psychopath and a liar and a predator, another predator. Good for me. And within a period of time, he went into a blind rage and started beating me. And it was like Charles Manson had slipped into his body. His eyes changed. He was not the same person. And he was beating me at my girlfriend's trailer. And blood was flying out of my body, splattering on the walls. And he's screaming. And he's screaming and screaming, yelling as I'm watching this. I kind of like stepped back, but I'm like, this is happening to my body. Holy shit. And I, at some point, realized that this was my dad again. It was the identical energy, the identical rage, the identical, like, unprovoked punishment. And I was pretty sure that he was going to kill me that night. And so as we were driving in the truck that he got from me, right? I'm funding everything. Good for me. We're driving from that location in Souk out to Shirley District, where we have a little cabin. I'm having this vision of my head being cut off, stuck in a ditch somewhere, and it would say in the Souk newspaper, fitness instructor's head found in ditch. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I think he's going to kill me. Like, I think this is it. And we went back to, I believe we went back to my mom's house or our house. And we went back and forth, but he was beating me and screaming at me and beating it and screaming and beating and screaming. And he just went ballistic. And at some point, and he's taking his Bowie knife and he's throwing it at my head, and it's going pop right by my head, and he'd pull it back out, come back, bong, keeps doing this, boing, and I'm just like, oh, fuck, if he misses, he's going to get me in the face. And I'm like, boy, I got to think on my toes here. And so I just said whatever he needed me to say, and eventually he calmed down. I managed to calm him down somehow. And then he, out of exhaustion, fell asleep. And I realized that I was like, you know, whatever I had been trying to escape, the pain that I was trying to escape, now I'd, you know, times 10,000 points. How much pain do I need before I'm going to go, wait a minute, maybe I need to look at myself. Maybe I need to look at my behavior. Maybe I need to make sure I'm not changing how I feel so I make choices that are unconscious. So I ended up putting him in jail.
Yeah.
They had to take x-rays of my face and my teeth to see if my teeth would have still remained in their sockets because they were loose from his assault. And I did, you know, testify against him, and he went to jail for 2 years. And in that time, I realized that even though it sounded really horrible, that anytime I thought of using, I just pictured the blood flying out of my face and him screaming and realizing, well, that's your bottom. I don't know if you would survive another one like that. And that I would also have picked another man that may have been better looking, that may have been a better provider, a better sweet talker, but I was primed to pick abusers, and I could see that. Yeah. And that if I used anything, alcohol, drugs, whatever, I would go underground, into this unconscious pattern and repeat the cycle, because that was what I thought normal was. That's what I thought love was, which clearly it's not. And what's even sadder is that's what I thought I deserved. And so I was a cook at Mom's Cafe with a woman named Lisa, and she had mentioned that she had managed to change her life through one of the 12-step programs, and I ended up, going and not taking it seriously at all. I was like, well, I'll just stop doing that one.
Yeah, picking and choosing.
I'll take that one. The rest of them are fine.
Yeah.
And what I discovered is that didn't work for me, and that eventually I was still, drug seeking the harder drugs and doing behavior that could get me killed, because I was having a few drinks. Mm-hmm. I was still kind of going into that creepy behavior because I didn't have anything to look forward to. Yeah. And so then I accepted that I couldn't do anything, and I stopped all of those substances and started to do a lot of work on myself and recognized that I had no life skills. Mm-hmm. The metaphor of the feral cat's pretty accurate. And I did a lot of talk therapy with a woman that was in our neighborhood that was just for people like me. Mm-hmm. And, she told me she was scared for me, and I laughed at her because I didn't realize what kind of danger I was in. My family upbringing allowed me to think that something that's dangerous was just interesting.
Normal.
Yeah. And then they say they say for some people that come from a traumatic background and have a lot of trauma bonding, which is what that all is, mm-hmm. They think that danger is chemistry. And so they're attracted to danger because it feels like, oh, I'm getting that hit. And really, they might be looking at someone who absolutely can destroy them quite easily, or destroy their life or their children or whatnot. So I remember talking to the therapist, and she was telling me that she was so scared for me, and I laughed at her. I thought, you're nuts. You don't know anything.
Do you think it's you're talking about these men, and you're getting abused, and as you're getting older, then you're seeking out these relationships, and you're ending up with these psychopaths, these abusers.
Yeah.
And then, this therapist is scared for you. Do you think in the relationships that you're going for, there's comfort in the familiar?
Absolutely.
I've heard that before. So it's almost like you seek out what's familiar to you because you know how to navigate in that. And that's what has been normal. And anything outside of that is actually abnormal, right?
Well, it's like trying to learn Chinese when you don't speak Chinese. Right. It's like, what do you mean?
Yeah. I'm going to go back to English here.
Yeah. And so we do what's familiar, mm-hmm. unless we change what's familiar. Like I was listening to a therapist not too long ago, and she said, I will make being cherished and adored familiar. And I was like, good affirmation, mm-hmm. So I write that down. What I recognize is that it's a miracle that I lived. That relationship ending was the worst relationship, in my opinion, that I'd ever had. And yet I'm working with this therapist who's trying to guide me. I'm not taking anything that she says seriously. I'm blowing her off. I'm like, pfft.
Like,
You know, you got this easy life, fuck off. You go home to your husband, whatever, no big deal. And then when I had about 6 months clean, I was able to go into this, it was a codependency treatment
yeah.
series. And, you know, we had to have 6 months before we could do it. And I was like, okay, I don't know what that word even means. I'm new to this recovery thing. I'm going into a new world. And we were to be in a room full of people where we were to line up. There's different exercises. And we're supposed to know when, as one person's walking towards us, when we need to say stop. And what I recognized is I had been so muted from even knowing who I am and what I want and what's right for me from such a young age that I couldn't say anything, but my insides were screaming before the person ever moved, which sort of gave me a little insight as to your ability to protect yourself is like not even close.
It's not there.
Right. And I didn't understand what it meant. All I knew was that this was the response. And then we did a meditation later that day, and the meditation was all about getting in touch with our inner child, and some people might know what that means, and it's really a metaphor for an archetype of the innocence within, and sometimes where the magic comes and the healing comes, and the therapeutic transformation can come when you have that connection and kind of rescue that part that's been abused. So we're on this deep meditation. I've never done anything like this, but we're asked to give our child something that we know our child would like. And I'm like, my little girl loves strawberries. Mm-hmm. And so we used to have horses and we used to ride horses. So I had this in the visualization. I went to a place where there's this big, beautiful oak tree, and I've got this little basket of strawberries. And we're to ask the inner child to come. And so she comes around the corner, and she's this beautiful little, just a little angelic. She looks like she's about 2.5. Little brown hair and the blue eyes and the white dress and the Buster Brown little shoes, and we're to give the child the gift. So I give her the berries, and then I'm all like, oh my God, you're so beautiful. And I never had an image that I had any true beauty, because I had thought that I must be a hideous monster because of the way people treated me. Yeah. It's like, there's got to be something fundamentally wrong here. So I'm looking at her and I'm like, you're so beautiful. And then we're to ask the child what the child wants from us. And so as I'm sitting there and I'm in this deep, deep emotional trance and I'm adoring her, she reaches across and she touches me on the knee, and I can feel it like it's happening in real time. And she looks me in the eyes and says, just love me. And I'm like, oh. And I'm looking at her going, nobody loved you. Nobody wanted you. Nobody cared about you. And then the grief started to spill out. And then the grief continued to spill. And I recognized that I had never had the message that this little girl was worth standing up for, or honoring, or speaking up for, or caring for, or even asking, are you okay? Like, that never happened. And so I start crying, and I'm crying in waves, like this layers of uncontrollable sobbing while I'm in this group of these people that are supposed to be able to relax, and I'm sobbing and I can't stop. And so I realize I'm disturbing the rest of the people, and I get in my car and I drive all the way home. It's about a 2-hour drive. I'm crying the whole way. I'm crying. I had no idea that all I really wanted was love. And I knew that I didn't know how to love myself. And I also knew that I was surrounded by people that were just fundamentally cruel, selfish, like hyenas. Take all the time, right? And so I went home and I cried for about 2 weeks straight, and I had no idea that I had this much pain inside of me. And I remember plotting out the murder of the therapist.
Yeah.
And I remember going to her and saying, I didn't know that I had this much pain. Like, I didn't hurt when I was drinking and drugging like this. Yeah. I've never had this much pain in my life. And I said, if this doesn't end, I'm going to take my life. Yeah. I can't do it. And so, I just, this is like, I've never had this much pain, because I was disassociated. I'd never connected to the real pain. Mm-hmm. And from there, I sent myself to Victoria, and I moved as far away from my mother as I could, because then I was like, whoa. Yeah, like it was like, wow. There was pieces starting to come. The puzzles were starting to come together, and I was just like, whoa. these people used me. I had a job. If I wasn't able to fulfill the job, I was abused, and it was never a job I could ever fulfill. So I was consistently abused, traumatically, generationally, back and forth. So I ended up renting a room out by Craig Derrick Castle in Victoria and just making recovery my number one thing.
Yeah.
And I was told to do that for the first year, do nothing but recovery.
Yeah.
So I did. And I cried a lot. And I contemplated suicide a lot. And I remember going to a conference. They call them a convention, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And this guy's up there and he's talking about his story, and I'm listening and I'm like, wow. And his story was horrific as well, you know. He tried to kill himself and he didn't manage to kill himself, and the white blood, blood all over the carpets and everything, and they're coming to check on him. Are you okay? No, everything's fine. You know, he's in there, there's blood everywhere, and he's trying to kill himself because he's run out of drugs and he's miserable. Anyway, so I remember getting up on the podium and saying, you know, I was still brand new, but I remember saying I didn't think I made mistakes. I felt like I was one. Like that level of shame was so ingrained. My sense of worthlessness was so deep that I didn't know how to put me back together. Like this was beyond a Humpty Dumpty situation. Yeah. And so I just hung on. And of course, what ends up happening to most young women in recovery is they're sexual, and we're not supposed to be. And I was, and I ended up being sexual with someone who was a psychopath. And I got pregnant. I had sex with him once. Before you know it, I'm pregnant. I put myself into a treatment center and find out that I'm pregnant. And I know whose it is. And I said, well, you told me that you were sterile. And you told me this and you told me that. And then he comes at me and he goes, well, we're going to get married now. And I'm going to buy you a sports here. And here's the engagement ring. And I said, you know what, buddy? I said, I trust you as far as I can throw you. And this is the way this goes. If I went with you anywhere, they'd find me cut up in a freezer somewhere. Basically get away from me. And so then his next strategy was to tell me that, you know, if I didn't do what he wanted, he would prove me an unfit mother, take the child away, and blah, 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 he's bullying me. So I ran away. I ran away from Victoria, and I went up to Nanaimo. Yeah. Because Nanaimo's recovery is so strong. And I knew that if I put recovery first, I had a shot. Yeah. So I moved up there, and I lived in a little trailer up there, up in, it's an area called Cedar. And I eventually gave birth to a beautiful baby boy on Mother's Day. And that was one of the first times in my life I felt like I did something right. Because he was beautiful. 10 fingers, 10 toes. And I'd done some treatment before then that had actually helped me address some of my sexual abuse that I had buried. Because I was busy protecting my mother. I was busy saying, no, I'm a slut. But this happened to me, and the therapist said, you know, 11-year-olds can't be sluts. And she said, you could lay on the ground, rip all your clothes off, scream, come fuck me, and if someone touches you, that's rape. She said, even up until you're 16. And I was like, huh? And I remember when I had to have the conversation in the group and discuss it and say, no, I was a slut, mother, I'm a slut. And then they circled around me and they said, you were raped and it wasn't your fault. And they meant it. And they looked at me, and I had this, like, it was like a shame rush. It came right up through me, and I fainted. I was like out cold because I was so busy protecting my mother, and I was scapegoating myself to protect her. So I didn't have to deal with the fact that I had been thrown down the river like that. Because then that meant that I was really raised by somebody who
takes down the walls.
Unbelievable. And then I was to report it, and I reported it, and I did all this stuff. And so, you know, for me, those walls of denial came down a little bit, and then I was like, who am I after this? And does this define me? And how do I make choices that are designed because they're true, or are these all like a trauma response or survival strategies? And I would say most of my behaviors are and have been survival strategies in some form of trauma. Yeah. And as I've gotten healthier and done more work and done more healing, like done some hypnotic work and some meditations and a daily, very specific sacred practice to stay in my right mind, I've learned, number one, that I am lovable and that we all are, but I've carried some of these lies and believed that they were true and then repeated them. And like, I don't believe that I was supposed to have lived, and yet for whatever reason I did.
So what would you say to people that are in toxic relationships, that are in addiction, that are in a similar circumstance that you're in? What would be your piece of advice for them, if you could say anything, right?
Forgive yourself and ask yourself if this is where you want to be in 5 years, right? I don't believe that we're bad, and I don't believe that we are stupid. I believe that we are programmed to do things that we really don't have much of a choice of doing. It's like, this is my download in expression. Unless there's some sort of an intervention where someone says, hey, I got you. If you're confused, talk to me. If you've got a question because you don't know how to make coleslaw, talk to me. And coleslaw can be the relationship. So for me, I think most people are in pretty unhealthy relationships. And that's where you don't talk, you don't think, you don't feel, you don't help each other win, you don't get your needs met. There's lying, there's betrayal, there's infidelity, there's dishonesty. I think if you can't feel safe in a relationship, it's not a good relationship. For me, if I don't feel safe, all I'm going to get is defects of character coming up to protect me.
Yeah.
And so then there needs to be the ability to have a conversation and to say, can we work this out? If it can't be worked out and you're going to live with that level of toxicity, you're living in hell. And then the question goes, is this where I want to be in 30 days or 60 days or 90 days or 12 months or a year or 5 years? And sometimes I've said that to people, are you happy? And if they say yes, I'm like, yay. And if you're not happy, then what do you think you need to help you be happy? And it's not more stuff. It's not more jewelry. It's not more plastic surgery. It's not losing another 10 pounds. It's not another car, another motorcycle, another sexual conquest. Those are escaping, trying to run away from the pain that lives inside. And the only way, out is through it. And most of us are taught that there's something bad in here. And yet if we give ourselves permission to have a voice and to speak up and tell the truth to ourselves, then at least there's hope. One of the teachers I had, he was a martial artist from Japan, and he said that where there is life, there is hope. Where there is no more life, there is no more hope. And I was like, pretty basic. So, I think most of us just repeat what we had modeled on some level.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. I think it takes who is the, I know we went over this, who was the person for you that kind of gave you that helped you to help pull you out of it, or what was the situation? We talked about what was the situation? It was when you met your inner self, when that happened. That was the moment for you, and that was through a friend asking you to get some help.
Yeah, my girlfriend said this is what helped her, and I went to do this codependency thing. And what was interesting after that time, having that visual and that kinesthetic touching and the looking in my face and saying, just love me, I realized that I didn't have a chance. I was set up to fail. My parents did not love me in a way that I actually felt loved. I felt like a worthless piece of shit. I felt like the lowest level of pond scum that a person could be because they treated me like that. So that's what I thought I was. And then my decisions after that were all about, am I giving that little girl what she deserves? Am I giving her what, am I helping her heal? There's an old saying in some of the ACA work is that it's never too late to relive your childhood. So when I made a decision, am I loving her? Am I bringing love to this part of me that has been so abandoned and neglected? And I picked my career based on those questions because I do have a playful, joyful, intuitive, magical part to me. So after that, I actually took training to become a clinical hypnotherapist, but I had to be a resident hypnotherapist, and I had to have a mentor. And I had a man who agreed to mentor me that lives in the area that I live, and his name is Fatah Taylor. And he was a very powerful, loving, peaceful man. And he would say to me, Germana, if you really want to help people, you must do your own inner work every day. And I'm like, what does that mean? Well, you need to have a sacred practice. You need to light a candle to remember that you're part of the divine. You need to have a prayer and meditation or a yoga practice, but every morning you need to do this to wind. It's like winding up an old-fashioned clock. Well, you wind it and it works properly for the next 24 hours. And he goes, and that's how you bring the best of you to your people. And so what was interesting about him is he would say to me, I'm here for you, and I'm here to help you love yourself. And I knew he didn't want anything from me sexually, and he was just doing it out of the goodness of his heart. And so in some way, because he held space for me and said, I'm here to love you, to help you love yourself, he gave me the courage to be willing to break my own agreements that there was something terribly wrong with me, to break my own rules, and to be willing to take that journey deep inside of me and to ask, what does love look like for you today?
Wow.
Yeah, he saved me. He became like my surrogate spiritual father, and he's still alive today. He really plunked me out because, not to be rude, but a lot of the people that I met in the 12-step recovery community, a lot of them helped me, but a lot of them were taking their unfinished shit out on me. And I was still the feral cat, so I might not be, showing up all warm and loving and open because I'm scared of rejection. I'm scared of betrayal. I'm scared of abandonment. So I'm sketchy too.
Yeah. So tell me about your book.
This book is a compilation of my family's legacy, and it weaves the layers of some of the hardships and some of the victories, and basically my whole life story up until 54, right?
Wow.
In here. And it also has some of the tools that I adopted in order to heal and recover myself, my dignity, my self-worth, my intelligence, my right to be educated, my right to be a better version of myself, my right to break the family rules and to let go of the secrets. So saying you're only as sick as your secrets. And even before my father was getting ready to die, he said to me, whatever you do, don't write a book.
Really?
And I'm like, so you're admitting you hurt me. Let me see if I got this right. You're admitting it, but you never would to my face. But you don't want me to expose you. Fascinating. So the book is designed to give people confidence and courage in their own healing journey. It talks about what is a narcissistic abusive relationship, what does psychopathic relationships look like, and it's also got a lot of links in the back for different layers of like education from YouTube videos and stuff from Dr. Gabor Mate and Dr. Romney and some Bradshaw work in there. It's really designed to say, if I can get through some of the horror shows that have been my life that I've actually survived, and I've managed to make a really good life with my life. There's been pitfalls. It's a process. It's not a party. What can you do? What can you overcome for yourself? If you're in an abusive relationship and you don't know what that looks like and how to stop the patterning, some of the stories in here would allow you to recognize perhaps some of your own unconscious patterns being repeated. And then it's got resources in the back on how to start your own healing journey. And, we're not a cake, we're never done. So for me, the book is it's not about grandiose for me at all. And this is what it looks like. It's about experience, strength, and hope. And saying with free will, with courage, no matter what it is, even the stuff with COVID or the loss of a child or the loss of a loved one, or the loss of whatever, a broken heart, we do recover. We can. Life won't be the same, but we can become better for it instead of embittered and toxic and sick. And, I was asked why I wanted to write the book, and I really didn't want to write the book. I felt like I needed to get it out of me and to let it go and to hopefully inspire other people to take their recovery further. Like they have first stage recovery, just don't do drugs and alcohol, but this is much deeper. This is second stage recovery. This is healing the wounds of the past. So whatever you don't heal and feel, you pass the trauma and the infection on to the next generation. So the children pay for it. I picked up the pieces for my parents. And the wish is that people take responsibility for their own broken hearts so that they can be whole and love. When we love, which is the highest purpose of being here, our life works. And we stop letting other people hurt us, including ourselves. Like I said, my heart was broken, but I continued to break it and not know that I was doing it. I just thought that was the way the world was, which is a lie. It was my world, but I had orchestrated it through my pain.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming and talking. That was amazing. I'm really excited for people to watch this and listen to it. And I'm going to put a link to your book. It'll be down below. Click on it, grab the book, check it out. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you for everything. It was amazing.
Okay.